In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And somewhere beyond the war, behind silk and music and a scent you'll never forget, there is a 6-year-old boy who just heard a single note played on a bone instrument and would burn the galaxy to hear it again. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is a confession, given to Imperial interrogators by a man named Veshkin, who was taken from a factory world at 6 years old by people who smelled like warmth and spoke like a lullaby. They asked him to describe his suffering. He refused, not because there wasn't pain, because there was love. And that, he says, is worse. This is a Slaanesh story, but not the one you're picturing. No excess, no screaming, no grotesque indulgence. This is the version where a child is raised in silk and music and genuine affection by something that should not be capable of any of those things. Where every morning was beautiful and every night was kind, and the trap was that none of it was a lie. It was all real. Every note, every touch, every word. And that is what makes it the most dangerous story we've ever told. They want him to say he was a prisoner. He won't. Decide for yourself what that means. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
They tell you that chaos corrupts, that it twists you, breaks you, makes you into something unrecognizable. They tell you the ruinous powers take everything good and beautiful and turn it rotten. I have sat across from 3 different interrogators now, and they have all said the same thing. They want me to weep. They want me to describe my suffering. They want me to say I was a prisoner, that I was tortured, that I was unmade and put back together wrong. And I will not give them that because it would be a lie. The truth is worse. The truth is that I was loved. The truth is that I was happy. The truth is that every morning I woke in silk and every evening I fell asleep to the most beautiful music a human mind can endure. And I would burn this entire galaxy down to hear it one more time. My name is Veshkin. That is the name I was given, and it is the name I keep. I had another before it, a name that tasted like factory soot and recycled air, but that name belongs to a dead boy, and I will not drag him into this. I was told to recount everything. Start from the beginning, they said. Make it complete. So here it is, all of it. I was born on Drenholm, which is not a world anyone remembers unless they are from there. A mid-tier industrial world in the Corvessian subsector, loyal to the God Emperor, productive in its tithes, unremarkable in every way that matters to the broader Imperium. My father operated a loom press in Fabrica District 9. My mother sorted textiles. I had an older sister named Tessane who could whistle better than anyone I have ever met, before or since. We lived in a habstack on the 42nd tier, which meant we were poor enough to eat reprocessed protein, but high enough to sometimes see the sky through the ventilation slats on clear days. It was a life. Not good, not bad. Drenholm had a smell to it, a thick chemical tang that sat at the back of your throat and never quite left, even when you slept. I remember that smell the way some people remember their mother's voice. It was the last honest thing I ever knew. I was 6 standard years old when they came for me. Not soldiers, not raiders, not slavers with shock mauls and cattle ships, which is what you might expect. What came for me was a woman in white gloves and a man who smelled like lavender and spoke in a voice so gentle it made you want to close your eyes. They came to our hab in the middle of the day cycle, while my father was at the fabricas and my mother was on shift. Tessane was watching me. She was 11. The woman knocked on our door and told Tessane she was from the Munitorum Census Bureau and needed to verify our residential records. The man stood behind her, smiling, holding a small silver case. Tenney let them in because that is what you did on Drenholm when someone from the Munitorum came to your door. You did not argue. You did not question. You opened the door and you prayed they were not there to increase your tithe or relocate your family to a lower tier. I remember the woman crouching down to look at me. She had eyes that were very dark, almost black, and her skin was the color of fresh parchment, pale and smooth in a way that no one on Drenholm ever looked. She smelled incredible. Not like perfume, not like anything I could name then or now, but like the idea of warmth itself, like the promise that somewhere in the galaxy there existed a place where everything felt good. She touched my cheek with one gloved finger and she said my name, my real name, the dead boy's name. She said it once and I felt something in my chest unlock, something I did not even know was closed. She asked me if I wanted to hear something beautiful. I nodded. Of course I nodded. I was 6. The man opened his silver case and inside was an instrument I had never seen. It was small, made of bone or something very like it, curved and polished to a pale sheen. I would learn its name years later. A cithrai, one of the old instruments, the smallest and most portable, designed for exactly this purpose. He put it to his lips and he played a single note, one note, and the world changed. I cannot describe what that note did to me in terms that will mean anything to someone who has not heard it. It was not loud. It was not complex. But it moved through me the way light moves through glass, passing through skin and muscle and bone and settling somewhere deep in the center of my skull where thinking happens. For the length of that one note, which could not have lasted more than 3 or 4 seconds, I understood what perfection was, not as a concept, not as an ideal, but as a physical sensation, a certainty in my blood. And then the note ended, and the world was just the world again, gray and chemical and flat. And I would have done anything, given anything, agreed to anything to hear it one more time. The woman asked me if I wanted to come with them. I said yes. I did not look at Tenney. I did not ask about my parents. I said yes, and I took her hand and I walked out of the only life I had ever known, and I did not feel a single shred of guilt or hesitation or loss. I was 6, and I was already theirs. I learned later what happened to Tenney. The Harmonic kept meticulous records of every acquisition, and Colvane showed me the file when I was old enough to read it without flinching. She screamed when I left. She ran after us into the corridor, and the man, still smiling, played another note and Tenney stopped. Not because she was paralyzed or unconscious, but because the note made her forget the last hour, the visitors, my leaving, perhaps more. When my parents came home, they found Tenney sitting on the floor of the hab, humming to herself, unable to explain where I had gone. The arbites were called. A search was conducted. My name was added to a list of missing children that was, I was later told, 9 pages long in Fabrica District 9 alone. Drenholm lost children the way other worlds lost rainfall. It was simply a thing that happened, and after a while, people stopped counting. I did not learn any of this until I was much older, and by then it meant nothing to me. The dead boy's family was a concept, like a story someone tells you about a place you have never visited. I could not feel what he had felt. I could not grieve what he had lost. Tessane had seen to that. Years later, when I thought back to the woman in white gloves, to those dark, almost black eyes and that impossible scent, I wondered whether it had been Tessane herself who came to Drenholm wearing a different face. Demons change their shapes the way musicians change their key. I never asked her. I was afraid the answer would make me love her more. Tessane. I should tell you about Tessane. The journey from Drenholm took 11 days in the belly of a merchant freighter that had been refitted to look like a Chartist trading vessel on the outside while being something else entirely within. The lower decks were normal enough, filled with bulk cargo and servitor-operated loading mechanisms and the usual stink of reclaimed air that all Imperial ships carry. But the upper decks, where I was taken, were different. The walls were lined with something that looked like velvet, but was softer, a deep iridescent purple that changed shade depending on the angle of the light. The air tasted faintly sweet. There was music playing at all times, not the single devastating note from the bone instrument, but a low ambient hum that sat at the edge of hearing and made everything feel cushioned, as though the sharp edges of reality had been filed down. I slept more easily on that ship than I had in my entire short life on Drenholm. There were other children, 4 of them ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 8. A girl with red hair and a permanent frown named Yvain, a boy called Silvus who did not speak, 2 brothers whose names I no longer remember because they did not survive the first year. We were kept together in a large cabin with soft bedding and food that tasted like nothing I had ever eaten, fruits and meats and pastries that exploded with flavor in ways that made you laugh out loud from the sheer, unexpected pleasure of it. We were not restrained. We were not threatened. No one hit us or locked us in cages or told us we had been sold. A woman named Calpurnia attended to us, tall and middle-aged and endlessly patient, and she told us we were going somewhere wonderful, somewhere we had been chosen for, and that everything was going to be better than anything we had ever imagined. You have to understand how that sounds to a 6-year-old from a mid-tier industrial world, where the best meal you have ever eaten was synthetic grox stew with actual seasoning. You have to understand what it means to a child who has never been told he is special, who has never worn clothes that did not itch, who has never tasted anything that was not manufactured in bulk. We were not being lied to, not exactly. Everything they promised, they delivered. That is the part that the interrogators never want to hear. Pelethan IV was a civilized world in the segmentum obscurus, far enough from any major warp route to avoid scrutiny and prosperous enough to support a population that prized culture and refinement above industry. It had opera houses and galleries and botanical gardens and all the trappings of a world that had achieved sufficient wealth to concern itself with beauty rather than mere survival. The upper spires of its capital, Elenthor, were home to dozens of noble houses, merchant dynasties, and artistic guilds, all of them competing for prestige and patronage in an endless social dance that had been playing out for centuries. It was into this world that the Gilt Harmonic had inserted itself, not as a hidden cell lurking in the shadows, but as one of the most respected musical institutions on the planet. Let me say that again, because it is important. The Gilt Harmonic was not hiding. They performed at the governor's court. They held recitals in the Grand Resonance Hall of Elenthor. Their compositions were played at state funerals and inaugurations and festivals. Noble families sent their children to study under their tutelage. Pelethan's aristocracy considered membership in the Harmonic to be a mark of extraordinary cultural achievement. And at the center of it all, presiding over every performance and every gathering and every initiation, was Tessane. She was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I do not say that with the breathless reverence of a cultist or the blind adoration of a child, though I was both of those things. I say it as a statement of observable fact, the way one might say that a star is bright or that the void is cold. Tessane was tall, willowy, with features that seemed to shift slightly depending on the light, always settling into whatever configuration would be most arresting to whoever happened to be looking at her. Her hair was the white of starlight, long and fine, and her eyes were a deep violet that darkened almost to black when she was pleased and lightened to a pale lavender when she was not. She moved the way water moves, with an effortless fluidity that made every gesture look like the natural conclusion of some perfect physical equation. Her voice was a mezzo-soprano that could fill a concert hall without amplification, every syllable landing with the precision of a scalpel. She was waiting for us when the ship docked at Pelethin's orbital station. She stood on the embarkation deck in a gown of layered white silk, her hands folded in front of her, and when she smiled at us, every single one of us children smiled back, even Silvus, who never smiled. Even the smaller of the two brothers, who had been crying for 3 days straight. She knelt down as the woman on Drenholm had knelt, and she looked at each of us in turn, spending a long time studying our faces with those shifting violet eyes. When she reached me, she tilted her head slightly, a musician hearing an unexpected chord, and she said, "This one hears it." She placed her hand on my chest over my heart, and I felt it again, that unlocking sensation, that opening. This one already hears the note. She named me Veshkin. She said it meant the one who listens, in a language I did not recognize. Years later, I learned it was not a language at all, not in any human sense, but a phonetic approximation of a word in a tongue that has never been spoken by mortal lips. A warp tongue, a demon's word for a demon's purpose. But I did not know that then. I knew only that Tessane had given me a name and that the name fit me perfectly, the way the right note fits the right chord, and that I loved her instantly and completely and without reservation. We were taken to the Harmonic's estate on the outskirts of Elenthor, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings arranged around a central courtyard that featured a fountain which did not spray water but rather emitted a continuous, barely audible tone that changed pitch with the time of day. The buildings were beautiful in a way that was subtly wrong, though I did not recognize the wrongness then. The architecture was organic, curving, with no true right angles, every surface a gentle arc that guided the eye and the body along paths that felt inevitable rather than designed. Colors shifted across the walls in slow, undulating waves, pastel purples and golds and pinks that never repeated exactly the same pattern twice. The floors were warm to the touch. The air carried traces of something that was not quite incense and not quite music, a scent-sound hybrid that defied easy categorization. This was my home for the next 19 years, and for most of those years I believed it was paradise. The education of a child within the Gilt Harmonic bore no resemblance to anything the Imperium would recognize as instruction. There were no primers, no catechisms, no rote memorizations of the Emperor's glory or the duties of a loyal citizen. There were no punishments for failure and no rewards for success because the concepts themselves were considered irrelevant. Tessane did not want obedient students. She wanted vessels, though I would not understand what that meant until much later. Our days were structured around sensation. In the mornings we ate, not the perfunctory caloric intake of a hive-worlder's ration schedule, but a deliberate, almost ceremonial engagement with food that could last 2 or 3 hours. Each meal was composed of dozens of small dishes, each one designed to evoke a specific response. A sliver of cured meat so intensely savory that it made your jaw ache. A fruit whose sweetness arrived in stages, building from a gentle suggestion to an almost overwhelming crescendo before fading into a lingering mineral aftertaste. A broth that was simultaneously hot and cold on the tongue, a trick of preparation I still do not understand. We were taught to eat slowly, to isolate each flavor, to notice how one taste modified the one that followed it. Calpurnia, our attendant, would ask us to describe what we experienced, not in general terms, but with precision. Sweet was insufficient. She wanted to know where the sweetness landed on the tongue, how long it lasted, what image or memory or physical response it produced. If you could not articulate your experience, you ate the dish again, and again, and again until you could. After meals came music. This was the core of the Harmonic's teachings, and the thing that separated us from whatever other Slaaneshi cells might have existed in the Imperium's vast and festering darkness. The Gilt Harmonic believed that sound was the primary medium through which the warp expressed itself in real space. Not psychic energy, not ritual, not blood or sacrifice, but sound, vibration, resonance. The universe, Tessane taught us, was a composition, an impossibly complex piece of music playing out across billions of years, and the warp was where the melody originated. Every material thing, from a grain of dust to a star, was a note in this composition, vibrating at a specific frequency, contributing its small part to the grand arrangement. And Slaanesh, the Prince of Excess, the Lord of Sensation, was the composer. Not a god in the way the ignorant masses understood gods, not a bearded patriarch dispensing judgment from a golden chair, but an artist of infinite capability whose medium was reality itself, and whose masterwork was the symphony of sensation that played endlessly through every living thing. I know how that sounds. I have had 3 interrogators tell me it is heresy, as though I did not already know. But heresy is a word for things you reject, and I was a child who had been given a framework for understanding the universe that was more beautiful and more internally consistent than anything the Imperial creed had ever offered me. On Drenholm, the Emperor was a face on a poster and a name you said before meals. In the Gilt Harmonic, Slaanesh was the explanation for why music made you cry, why certain colors looked more beautiful at dusk, why the touch of another person's hand could make you feel less alone in a galaxy that was mostly emptiness. You tell me which theology a 7-year-old is going to gravitate toward. We learned instruments, all of us. Not 1, not 2, but as many as we could manage, and the harmonics collection was vast. There were conventional instruments, strings and winds and percussion, many of them antiques from worlds I had never heard of. And then there were others. Instruments that had no names in Gothic, made from materials that were not quite metal, and not quite bone, and not quite glass, shaped into forms that hurt the eye if you looked at them for too long. Tessane called them the old instruments, and she handled them with a reverence that bordered on worship, which, of course, it was. I had an aptitude. That is not pride speaking, it is fact. Whatever quality Tessane had identified in me when she said, "This one hears it," manifested as an ability to perceive and reproduce sound with unusual fidelity. I could hear overtones that other children missed. I could identify the precise frequency at which a string was tuned by the way it felt against my fingertips before I even plucked it. I could hold a melody in my head after a single hearing and reproduce it hours later without error. Calpurnia said I had a gift. Tessane said I had a purpose. At the time, I did not see the difference. Even was the other standout among our group. The red-haired girl with the permanent frown had arrived from a feral world called Gruenstadt, taken from a settlement of maybe 200 people who worshipped the Emperor as a fire god and had never seen a piece of technology more complex than a hand-cranked grain mill. She should have been destroyed by the transition, by the overwhelming sensory assault of the Harmonic's estate after a lifetime of dirt roads and animal skins. Instead, she adapted with a ferocity that impressed even Tessane. Where I listened, Even consumed. She ate every dish as though it might be taken away. She played every instrument as though she were trying to break it, ringing from each one, sounds that should not have been possible. Ugly sounds, discordant sounds, sounds that set your teeth on edge and made your skin crawl. And Tessane loved it. Because the harmonic was not about beauty. Not really, it was about intensity. Silvus died in the 3rd month. He had never spoken a word since his arrival, and one morning Calpurnia found him in his chambers, sitting upright in his bed, his eyes open, his mouth stretched into a smile so wide it had split the corners of his lips. There was no mark on him, no injury, no sign of violence. He had simply heard something in the night that was too much for his mind to contain, and his body had responded by shutting down. Calpurnia wrapped him in silk and took him away, and none of us saw the body again. The two brothers lasted longer, perhaps 8 months, before they began to deteriorate. One of them developed a tremor in his hands that made it impossible to hold an instrument. The other started hearing music that no one else could hear, at all times, even in silence, and he would scream and claw at his ears, trying to make it stop. They were taken away one night while the rest of us slept. I did not ask where they went. I already knew, on some level that I could not articulate, that asking questions about the ones who disappeared was not how things worked in the Gilt Harmonic. By my 10th year, there were only 2 of us left, me and Yvain, and by then, we were no longer children. I should explain what I mean by that, because it is easy to assume the worst, and the worst is not quite accurate. The Gilt Harmonic did not abuse children. Not in the way you are thinking, not in the way the interrogators keep suggesting with their carefully worded questions and their barely concealed disgust. What the Harmonic did was more insidious, and I think more effective. They removed childhood entirely. Not through trauma or violence, but through saturation. By the time I was 10, I had eaten foods from 100 different worlds. I had heard compositions that spanned the full range of human emotional experience. I had been taught to analyze sensation with the precision and detachment of a Scholam student doing arithmetic. I had been given the tools to appreciate beauty and the vocabulary to describe suffering and the framework to understand both as expressions of the same fundamental force. What I had not been given was innocence. Not because it was taken from me, but because it was replaced, methodically and lovingly, with something else. Awareness. An awareness so acute and so comprehensive that it left no room for the comfortable ignorance that childhood requires. By 10, I could identify the emotional state of any person in a room by the rhythm of their breathing. By 12, I could play compositions on the old instruments that made hardened mercenaries weep without understanding why. By 14, I could hear the faint, subsonic pulse that ran through the walls of the Harmonic's estate like a heartbeat, a sound that Tessane told me was the voice of the warp itself, pressing against the thin membrane of real space, singing to those who had the ears to hear it. Tessane took a personal interest in my development that went beyond what she afforded the other students. The Harmonic was not small, perhaps 300 members at its peak during my time there, ranging from new initiates, fresh from Pelethon's aristocracy, to senior devotees who had served for decades and whose bodies had begun to show the marks of prolonged warp exposure in subtle ways. An extra joint in a finger, pupils that reflected light at the wrong angle, skin that was too smooth, too elastic, as though something beneath it was trying to push outward into a different shape. Among all of these, I was Tessane's project, her protégé, her instrument. She taught me personally in sessions that lasted hours, not music, or not only music. She taught me how to listen beyond sound, to perceive the emotional content of a space as a psyker perceives psychic resonance, but without the warp touch that would have attracted the Inquisition's attention. She taught me that every person carries a melody within them, a unique harmonic signature composed of their memories and fears and desires, and that if you listen carefully enough, you can hear it. Not with your ears, with something deeper, something that sits in the marrow of your bones and the fluid of your spine. She called it the inner ear, and developing it was, she said, the highest achievement a mortal could attain. I believed her. Throne help me, I believed every word because she demonstrated it. She could walk into a room of strangers and tell you, within minutes, the secret fears and hidden wants of every person present. She could touch an instrument that had been played by someone 100 years ago and reproduce the melody they had played, note for note, as though the instrument remembered. She could sing a single sustained tone and make you feel, truly feel, any emotion she chose. Joy, grief, longing, terror, love. Not the idea of these things, but the raw, unfiltered experience of them, as vivid and overwhelming as the real thing. It was not psychic power, or so she claimed. It was mastery of resonance, an understanding of the vibrational nature of consciousness so profound that it bordered on the divine. And she loved me. I want that to be clear because it is the part that no one believes. Tessane loved me the way a sculptor loves a block of unmarred stone, with anticipation, with hunger, with a genuine appreciation for what I was, and an even greater appreciation for what I could become. She held me when I was frightened. She sang to me when I could not sleep. She praised me when I achieved something difficult, and she corrected me with patience and gentleness when I failed. She gave me everything a child needs to feel safe and valued and wanted, and she did it all in the service of something monstrous, and I cannot, even now, even after everything, find it in myself to hate her for it. There was another figure in the Harmonic who deserves mention, though he will become more important later. His name was Colvain Resh, and he was the closest thing I had to an older brother. Colvain had been taken as I had been, stolen from a hive world called Thesken Ultima at the age of 4, and by the time I arrived at Pelethan, he was already 17 and deep enough into the Harmonic's inner circle to know things that I was still years away from learning. He was tall and lean, with the kind of angular face that looked carved rather than grown, and he moved with the controlled precision of someone who was always, at every moment, aware of exactly where his body was in space. He played the caravane, one of the old instruments, a thing of curved bone and silver wire that produced sounds in ranges the human ear should not have been able to perceive. He played it better than anyone in the Harmonic except Tessane herself. Colvain took me under his care with an easy, unforced warmth that I gravitated toward immediately. He was the one who taught me the practical skills that Tessane considered beneath her attention. How to dress, how to carry myself in the manner of Pelethan's aristocracy, how to eat at a formal table without revealing that I had spent my first years scooping reprocessed protein paste from a tin. He taught me how to fight, too, because the Harmonic was not merely a musical institution, and its members were not merely musicians. Every devotee of the Gilt Harmonic trained in combat from a young age, and the combat was unlike anything the Imperial Guard or even the Adeptus Astartes would recognize. It was silent, it was fluid. It was based entirely on the principle that every opponent generates a rhythm through their movements and their breathing and their heartbeat, and that if you can hear that rhythm, you can predict every strike, every dodge, every hesitation before it happens. Colvain could disarm a man twice his size without making a sound, his body flowing around the attack like water around a stone, exploiting gaps in the opponent's rhythm that the opponent did not even know existed. He was kind to me. He joked and laughed and told me stories about the worlds he had visited in the Harmonic's service. Sanitized versions of missions, I later learned, had been considerably less charming than he made them sound. He never lied to me, not directly, but he curated the truth with an artist's precision, presenting the Harmonic's reality in the most favorable light, while omitting the parts that would have disturbed a child. He was, in his own way, as much a creation of Tessane as I was. The difference was that Colvain had chosen to remain, and I had not yet been given the chance to choose. I was 15 when I first attended a rendering. That is what they called it. Not a sacrifice, not a ritual, not a ceremony. A rendering. The word was chosen with the same deliberate precision that the harmonic applied to everything, because it was technically accurate. What happened during a rendering was the extraction of raw sensation from a living subject, the systematic stimulation and amplification of their capacity to feel until the boundary between body and experience dissolved, and what remained was pure, undiluted emotion, stripped of context, stripped of identity, stripped of everything except its vibrational essence. This essence was then channeled through the old instruments, through the voices of the senior devotees, through the architecture of the rendering chamber itself, into a harmonic pattern that resonated with frequencies beyond the material plane. It was, in the language of the harmonic, the creation of music from the raw material of human experience. It was, in the language of the Imperium, the torture and murder of a human being as an act of demonic worship. The chamber was beneath the estate, deep enough underground that no sound could escape, and no sound from above could intrude. It was circular, 60 meters across, with walls of polished stone that had been carved with geometric patterns I now recognize as Slaaneshi sigils, disguised as decorative motifs. The ceiling was a dome, and the dome's interior was covered in a mosaic of tiny mirrors that reflected and fractured the light from a single lumen globe suspended at the apex, creating a shifting constellation of pinpoint reflections that moved slowly across the walls and floor, like the rotation of an unfamiliar sky. The acoustics were extraordinary. A whisper at one edge of the chamber could be heard with perfect clarity at the other. A single note played at the center would reverberate for minutes, layering upon itself, building harmonic complexity with each reflection until the original sound was buried beneath its own echoes. I was brought to the chamber by Colvane, who said nothing as we descended the spiraling staircase, but kept his hand on my shoulder the entire way down, a gesture that I now understand was not comfort, but restraint. He was ready to hold me back if I tried to run. He was ready to carry me down if I froze. He had done this before with other children, and he knew the range of possible reactions. What he did not expect was mine. The subject was already in place when we arrived. A man, middle-aged, stripped bare and suspended at the center of the chamber by thin cables attached to a harness that spread his limbs outward in an X shape. He was conscious. He was gagged. His eyes were wide and wet and moving constantly, scanning the chamber and the people who were beginning to arrange themselves around its perimeter with the frantic energy of an animal that has realized, with absolute and terminal certainty, that it is about to die. I did not know where he had come from. I did not know his name or his crimes, or whether he had committed any crimes at all. He was a man, and he was going to be rendered, and that was all the information the harmonic considered relevant. Tessane stood at the far side of the chamber, facing the subject, dressed in a gown of pale violet that left her arms and shoulders bare. In her hands she held an old instrument that I had never seen before, larger than the caravan, with a body that pulsed faintly with its own inner light, a slow, rhythmic glow that matched the beating of a heart. Behind her, arranged in a semicircle, were 12 senior devotees, each holding an instrument, each silent, each waiting. She looked at me and smiled, and even in that place, even with a condemned man hanging before me, the smile made me feel safe. "Listen," she said, "just that. Listen." And then they began. I will not describe what they did to the man, not because the interrogators have not asked. They have, in detail, repeatedly, but because the physical actions were almost beside the point. What mattered was not what was done to his body, but what was done with the sounds his body produced. Every gasp, every muffled scream, every wet involuntary sound of flesh under duress was caught by the chamber's acoustics and amplified, and the devotees played their instruments in response, not accompanying the suffering but interpreting it, translating it into something that resembled music, in the same way that a painting of a fire resembles an actual conflagration. The sounds they produced should not have been possible, frequencies that vibrated in the chest rather than the ears, harmonics that seemed to come from inside your own skull, a bass tone so low and so sustained that it felt like the floor of the chamber had become the surface of a drum being struck by something immeasurably large and immeasurably patient. And Tessane sang. Her voice rose above everything else, a clear, sustained note that cut through the layers of sound like a blade through silk, and where it passed, the chaos organized itself into pattern. The screaming became rhythm. The instrumental accompaniment became melody. The bass drone became the foundation of a chord that was, and I recognize the obscenity of saying this, extraordinarily beautiful. Not beautiful in the way a sunrise is beautiful or a child's laughter is beautiful. Beautiful the way a perfect mathematical proof is beautiful, because it was precise, because it was inevitable, because every element was exactly where it needed to be. The result was a structure of sound so complete and so self-contained that it seemed to exist independent of the performers, independent of the suffering that fueled it, independent of the chamber and the planet and the galaxy itself. It was as though something vast and ancient had leaned in close to the fabric of reality and was breathing through us, using us as its throat, and the breath was song. I did not run. I did not vomit. I did not look away or cover my ears or scream. I stood at the edge of that chamber with Colvain's hand on my shoulder, and I listened, and what I felt was not horror but recognition. The same recognition I had felt when the man played the bone instrument in my hab on Drenholm. The same unlocking in my chest. The same certainty that I was hearing something true, something fundamental, something that the rest of the universe was designed to disguise. The man in the harness was dying, and the sound of his death was the most honest thing I had ever heard. After that, I attended every rendering, and within a year I was participating. The Gilt Harmonic acquired its subjects through a network of intermediaries that spanned half the subsector. Criminals purchased from corrupt arbites, debtors sold by creditors who asked no questions. Underhive gangers captured in raids blamed on rival gangs. The supply was consistent and the demand was modest, perhaps 6 or 7 renderings per standard year. And through it all, the public performances continued. Governor Melchise himself applauded compositions performed by Tessane's most presentable students in the Grand Resonance Hall, never suspecting that the true art of the harmonic played out in the chamber beneath the estate. The surface performances were technically brilliant, but emotionally sterile. They were the respectable facade behind which the real work continued. And the real work was reaching deeper into the fabric of the warp, searching for the frequency at which the barrier between material and immaterial became thin enough to tear. I grew into my role within the harmonic as any young craftsman grows into a trade, with practice and repetition and gradual mastery. By 17, I could play 6 of the old instruments with proficiency and 3 with genuine skill. I could hear the harmonic signatures of individuals without conscious effort, instinctively, as a native speaker of a language hears grammar without thinking about rules. I could identify the emotional content of a room from the hallway outside, reading the collective mood through the walls like a hound reading a scent on the wind. And during renderings, I could sustain a complimentary tone for the full duration of the event, sometimes hours, holding my part of the ensemble without wavering while the subject's screams rose and fell and eventually stopped. Even had taken a different path. Where I refined, she escalated. Her playing had always been aggressive, angular, more interested in the breaking point of an instrument than its sweet spot. And as she grew older, this tendency calcified into something harder and more dangerous. She did not simply participate in renderings, she led them. By 16, she had devised a new technique that involved playing two old instruments simultaneously while vocalizing a counter-melody, a feat that required a level of neural coordination that Tessane said should have been physiologically impossible. The sounds Even produced during renderings were devastating, capable of inducing involuntary physical responses in the audience, tremors and tears and laughter and nausea, all at the same time, all layered on top of each other like geological strata being compressed into diamond. She frightened me in a way that nothing else in the harmonic ever had, not because of her cruelty, but because of her enthusiasm. She loved what she did. She loved it with a purity and a completeness that left no room for doubt or hesitation or mercy. She was, I realized much later, exactly what Tessane wanted me to be. The warp had begun to change her too. Her hair had deepened to a shade of arterial red so vivid it seemed to pulse with its own light. Her pupils had elongated into something between human and feline. Her voice had developed a subsonic overtone that produced unease in anyone who listened too long. She did not hide these changes the way Colvane hid his. She displayed them, daring people to flinch, daring them to name what they saw. To be marked by the warp was, in the harmonic's theology, evidence of proximity to the divine. Even was closer than anyone except Tessane, and she intended to close the remaining distance or die trying. In the end, she got both. Not long before the culmination was announced, I found Even alone beside the courtyard's tonal fountain, vibrating at the fountain's exact frequency, with such precision that her body and the instrument had become one. When she opened her eyes and looked at me, those elongated pupils catching the starlight, she said, "Something cracked in you, Veshken. I can hear it. A wrong note, buried deep." I had told no one about the change inside me. She heard it anyway. That was Even. She heard what you hid the way other people heard what you said. I walked away without answering, but I am getting ahead of myself. The years between 15 and 20 were the years in which I became fully enmeshed in the harmonic's operations beyond the estate. I traveled with senior devotees, attending gatherings on neighboring worlds where the harmonic maintained connections with other Slaaneshi cells. I served as a performer at private events hosted by Pelathan's elite, and I went on acquisitions, the procurement of subjects for rendering, or, more rarely, the procurement of new children for the harmonic's cultivation program. I did this because I was asked to, and because objection simply did not occur as a possibility. I was a component. I performed my purpose. The machine ran smoothly. Colvane was my partner on most of these missions. He was older now, in his early 30s, and the years of warp exposure had begun to leave their marks. Extra knuckles on his fingers, hidden beneath gloves. Eyes that glowed a faint violet in low light. Hearing so acute he wore dampening plugs in public. He was still kind, still warm, still the closest thing I had to family. And he was, beneath the kindness, a killer of considerable skill and complete indifference. Between the two of us, we could extract a target from a public space in broad daylight without anyone noticing until we were already gone. I killed for the first time when I was 18, not during a rendering, where the killing was communal and ritualized and distributed among the ensemble like a shared burden. A direct personal kill, face to face, close enough to feel the heat leaving the body. We were on an acquisition run in the underhive of Pelathan's secondary city, Morven. Our target was a woman in her 30s, a former factory overseer living rough in the underhive. No family, no friends, no one who would look for her. She was, in the cold arithmetic of the harmonic, ideal. Colvane and I found her in a drinking den near the waste processors. I could hear her harmonic signature from outside, a low, flat drone of exhaustion and resignation. Colvane approached her, smiled, bought her a drink, and within 10 minutes she was laughing and her signature had shifted to something lighter, tentative, almost hopeful. That was the cruelest part, the moment of hope. We led her out through a side entrance into an alley where a ground car was waiting. She was halfway through asking where we were going when I pressed the dampening cloth over her face. It was at this point that something went wrong. A man had followed us from the drinking den. He was large, scarred, missing most of his left ear, and he had the look and the bearing of someone who had survived the underhive long enough to develop a keen instinct for when something was not right. He came around the corner of the alley just as the woman slumped into unconsciousness, and for a moment the three of us stood there in the half-light, Colvane and I, and this stranger. All of us recalculating. The man drew a knife. It was a crude thing, a sharpened piece of industrial scrap wrapped in cord. But he held it like he knew what to do with it. He said something about letting her go. He said it without much conviction, which told me he did not actually care about the woman, but saw an opportunity to assert himself, or possibly to rob us. I could hear his rhythm, fast and shallow, the heartbeat of someone running on adrenaline and bad nutrition, and within that rhythm I could hear the gaps, the moments where his body committed to one action before his mind had finished deciding. The microsecond delays between intent and execution that, in the Harmonic's combat training, were the only openings that mattered. I did not think about it. I moved the way Colvane had taught me, fluid and unhesitating, finding the path of least resistance and flowing through it. The man lunged. I stepped to the side, caught his wrist at the apex of the thrust, redirected his momentum past me, and drove my palm into his throat with the heel of my hand. He went down, making a sound that was halfway between a cough and a gurgle. I stood over him, watching him choke, listening to the rhythm of his dying the way I had been trained to listen to everything, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not guilt, not revulsion, not excitement. I felt the same calm, attentive emptiness that I felt during a rendering. The man was producing a sound, and the sound was interesting, and then the sound stopped. Colvane watched me from beside the ground car, his expression unreadable. He did not praise me or congratulate me or comment on my technique. He simply waited until I was finished, and then he said, "We should go," and we went. The woman was delivered to the estate the following morning. She was rendered 3 days later. The man in the alley was left where he fell. The underhive would take care of the rest. I was 18 years old. I had been trained since childhood to perceive the world through the lens of sound and sensation, to understand human beings as instruments that could be played and eventually consumed, and to view the taking of life as a mechanical process no more morally significant than the tuning of a string. I was not broken. I was not damaged. I was functioning exactly as designed. The first crack appeared 2 years later during a mission that took me off Peloton for the first time in years. I was 20. Tessane had received intelligence that a rival Slaaneshi cult operating on a world called Gevrin's Landing had obtained an old instrument of significant power, a thing she called the Voxalis, which she described as the throat of a demon made solid. She wanted it. She sent me to get it, along with Colvane and a small team of the Harmonic's more combat-capable members. Gevrin's Landing was a feudal world on the edge of the subsector, technically Imperial, but so far from meaningful oversight that its single Arbites's precinct was staffed by 3 exhausted officers who spent most of their time pretending the rampant smuggling on the northern continent was not happening. The rival cult was small, perhaps 40 members, operating out of an estate in the hills. They were less sophisticated than the Harmonic, more inclined toward garish, obvious worship. Tessane regarded them with the disdain of a concert pianist for a busking street musician. They had the devotion, but not the art. But they had the Voxalis, And that was enough. We infiltrated the estate on the third night after our arrival, moving through the perimeter in silence, our rhythms synchronized with the ambient sounds of the hill country, the wind in the grass, the nocturnal insects, the distant crash of waves against the northern cliffs. The estate was poorly guarded. The cult had grown complacent in their isolation. We were inside before they knew we were there. What followed was efficient and brutal, and over in less than 20 minutes. Colvane led the assault, his body flowing through the estate's corridors like something not entirely human, dispatching cultists with a speed and a silence that made the killings feel less like combat than like editing, removing unnecessary elements from a composition. I followed behind, listening for the harmonic signatures of anyone hiding, anyone preparing an ambush, anyone reaching for a weapon they should not have had. There were no surprises. The rival cult died quickly and with minimal noise, which was, I think, something of an insult given their devotion to the god of sensation. I found the Voxalis in a locked chamber on the estate's uppermost floor. It was smaller than I had expected, perhaps the length of my forearm, made of a material that looked like black glass, but was warm to the touch and slightly yielding, like skin over muscle. It had no visible openings, no mouthpiece, no strings, nothing that indicated how it was meant to be played. When I picked it up, I heard it. Not a sound, exactly, but an absence of sound so specific and so shaped that it functioned as a negative note. A silence in the precise form of the tone it was not producing. It was like holding a hole in the world. There was something else in that chamber. In the corner, behind a curtain of violet fabric, there was a cage. And in the cage there was a boy. He could not have been older than 4, filthy, dressed in rags that had once been dyed in the cult's colors, but had since faded to the gray of neglect. He was awake, sitting with his knees pulled to his chest, and he was looking at me with eyes that I recognized because I had seen them in my own reflection a long time ago. The eyes of a child who has been taken from one world and placed into another, and has not yet learned the rules of the new one. His harmonic signature was a mess, a discordant tangle of fear and confusion, and something else, something faint and trembling beneath the noise that was the remnant of whoever he had been before the cult had gotten hold of him. They had started working on him. I could hear it. The faint traces of conditioning in the way his breathing hitched when I moved too quickly. The way his fear modulated when he saw the Voxalis in my hands, shifting from panic to something closer to reverence. Trained responses. The earliest stages of the process I knew so well. I looked at him, and I saw myself at 6, standing in a hab on Drenholm, listening to a note played from a bone instrument, and deciding to leave everything behind. I saw what I had been before the harmonic made me into what I was, and I felt nothing. I looked at this boy, this tiny broken thing that a cruder version of my own cult had been reshaping in a cruder version of my own image, and I felt no pity and no recognition and no urge to help. I catalogued his harmonic signature, noted the stage of his conditioning, assessed his potential value as a future asset, and dismissed him. I turned around and I walked out of the chamber, and I left him in his cage, and I did not think about him again for months. When I did think about him on a night when sleep would not come and the subsonic pulse of the estate was louder than usual, I did not feel guilt. I felt curiosity, not about the boy, but about myself. About the fact that I had looked at a mirror image of my own stolen childhood and felt nothing at all. I filed that curiosity away in the same place I filed everything that did not fit the harmonics framework. But it stayed. Things that do not fit have a way of doing that. But the child is not what cracked me. What cracked me happened after, during our extraction, when we passed through the town at the base of the hills on our way to the shuttle that would take us back to Pelothon. The town was called Ebanmir. It was nothing. A few hundred buildings of local stone, a market square, a water pump, a chapel dedicated to the god emperor that was little more than a wooden shed with an aquila painted on the door. We moved through it in the pre-dawn darkness, 6 figures in dark clothing carrying a dead cult's prize, and we should have passed through without stopping. But there was a light on in one of the buildings near the market square, and the sound coming from inside that building stopped me in my tracks. It was a woman singing to a child, a lullaby. The melody was simple, 3 notes repeating in a pattern so basic that a first-year student at the Harmonic would have dismissed it as beneath consideration. The woman's voice was untrained, pitchy, cracking on the higher notes. The child was perhaps 2 years old, fussing and whimpering, not yet asleep. The woman sang the same 3 notes over and over, patient and unhurried, and her harmonic signature was a thing I had no name for because I had never encountered it in the Harmonic. It was warm and steady and entirely focused on the child, a single sustained note of devotion so complete that there was no room in it for anything else. No ambition, no desire, no hunger for sensation or perfection or transcendence. Just a woman holding her child in the dark and singing badly and meaning every note more than Tessane had ever meant anything in her existence. I stopped walking. The others moved on without me, not noticing for a few paces, and I did something I cannot explain by any logic I possessed at the time. I walked toward the building. The door was not locked. On a world this small and this remote, doors were not locked. I pushed it open, and I stepped inside, and I stood in the front room of a fisherman's cottage, smelling salt and dried nets and wood smoke, and through the doorway to the back room I could see her. She was sitting in a wooden chair with the child across her lap, rocking slowly, her face half lit by a tallow candle on the windowsill. She was not young, and she was not beautiful, and she was wearing a patched nightdress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was mostly gone, and she was singing those 3 notes as though they were the only sounds that mattered in the entire galaxy. She saw me. She must have seen me, a stranger standing in her doorway in the dark, dressed in the kind of clothing that did not belong on a feudal world, with eyes that had looked upon things no honest person should see. She saw me, and she did not scream. She did not reach for a weapon or call for help. She pulled the child closer to her chest, and she kept singing. The same 3 notes, the same cracked voice. Her harmonic signature did not change, did not spike with fear or alarm, because the child was in her arms, and the child needed the song to continue, and nothing else. Not the stranger in the doorway, not the danger he might represent. Nothing else was permitted to interrupt the melody. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. It was probably 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, something inside me, something that had been locked away so long ago that I had forgotten it existed, stirred. Not the dead boy's memories, not the ghost of Hend Polek from Fabrica District 9 on Drenholm. Something older and more basic than memory. A recognition of what I was hearing that bypassed everything the Harmonic had taught me and landed directly in the part of my brain that was still, despite everything, human. I thought of the boy in the cage on Gevrin's landing. I thought of myself at 6, and for the first time I felt the faintest tremor of something that was not quite grief and not quite shame but occupied the space between them, a frequency I had no training to process. I left. I closed the door behind me as quietly as I had opened it. Colvane was waiting at the edge of the square, his expression unreadable. "Veshkin, we are leaving." We returned to Pelethan with the Voxalis, and Tessane was pleased and everything continued as before. But I was different, not in a way that anyone could observe, not in a way that I could articulate, even to myself. Something had shifted, a frequency had changed, and the picture that had seemed so complete and so perfect now had a flaw in it that I could not stop noticing. The lullaby, the 3 notes, The woman's cracked, imperfect voice, and the absolute sincerity behind it. And the fact that she had looked at me and chosen the child over her own fear, without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the elaborate frameworks I had spent my life learning. For the first time in my life, I understood that there existed a kind of music that the Gilt Harmonic could not play. I told no one. Not Colvane, not Yvain, certainly not Tessane. I pushed it down, and I carried on, and I performed my duties, and I attended renderings, and I killed when killing was required, and I did all of it with the same outward composure that I had always maintained. But inside, in the place where the inner ear lived, something was listening to a different song now, and it was getting louder. 5 years passed before Tessane announced the culmination. 5 years of renderings and acquisitions, and the slow widening of a crack I could not repair. I performed. I did what was asked of me. I smiled at Tessane and played for her and told myself that the 3 notes from Ebanmir meant nothing. The crack held, but it did not close. She gathered the entire harmonic in the grand performance hall of the estate, all 300 members, from the newest initiates to the oldest devotees, and she told us that the time had come. The years of preparation, the decades of renderings, the patient accumulation of resonant energy, all of it had been building toward a single event. The culmination would be the greatest rendering ever performed, a composition of such scope and power that it would, she said, tear a permanent opening in the veil between real space and the warp. Not a temporary breach, not a momentary flickering, but a sustained and stable gateway through which the true music of the Prince of Excess would pour into real space and transform Pelethin IV into a demon world, a paradise of infinite sensation, an eternal concert. The hall erupted, 300 voices raised in exultation, the sound of it hitting the ceiling and reflecting back as a roar that shook the floor beneath my feet. Yvain was on her feet, her eyes wide, her frown replaced for once by something that looked like rapture. Colvane was clapping, measured and precise, his luminous eyes bright with an emotion I had rarely seen in him. Even I felt it, the pull, the excitement, the intoxicating possibility of what Tessane was describing. This was what we had been building toward. This was the purpose that justified everything. Every rendering, every death, every child stolen from an industrial world and reshaped into an instrument. And then Tessane told us what the culmination required, and the room changed. She needed 12 subjects, not the usual acquisitions, not criminals or debtors or underhive nobodies. 12 individuals of specific harmonic resonance, 12 voices that would form the foundation of the composition. She had been identifying candidates for years, she said. Nobles of Pelethan, members of the governor's court, individuals whose positions and connections made them too prominent to simply disappear. The culmination would require the harmonic to reveal itself, to drop the pretense that had protected it for centuries, and act openly for the first time. There would be no going back. Once the ritual began, the harmonic would be exposed, and its survival would depend entirely on its success. If the culmination worked, exposure would be irrelevant because there would be no Imperium left on Pelethan to oppose them. If it failed, they would all die. I looked at Tessane standing at the front of the hall, radiant in her conviction, her violet eyes blazing with a light that was not entirely reflected from the lumen globes, and I saw something in her that I had missed. Not just missed, been prevented from seeing. A hunger, not the refined aesthetic hunger that the harmonic cultivated, not the controlled appetite for sensation that made us what we were, but something raw and older and vastly more powerful, something that had been wearing the shape of the way a hand wears a glove. I had never questioned what she was. In 19 years, it had never occurred to me to ask, because the answer seemed so obvious. She was our leader. She was our teacher. She was the most gifted musician on Pelethan and the most devoted servant of the Prince of Excess. She was Tessane, but standing in that hall, watching the light in her eyes pulse and shift in a rhythm that did not match any human heartbeat, I heard something I had never heard before. Her harmonic signature, the one I had listened to for nearly 2 decades, the one I had assumed I knew as intimately as my own, was not hers. It was not human. It was not even mortal. Beneath the beautiful surface melody that she projected to the world, beneath the warmth and the grace and the effortless charisma, there was a bass note so deep and so vast that it had no business existing inside a human body. It was the sound of something ancient and enormous and insatiably hungry, something that had been feeding on us, on our devotion and our artistry and our murdered subjects for longer than any of us had been alive. Tessane was not a woman. She was not even a mortal. She was a demon of Slaanesh wearing human skin, and she had been conducting us like an orchestra, drawing from us exactly the sounds she needed, shaping us into the instruments of a ritual that would devour the world. The Gilt Harmonic was not a cult. It was a machine built over centuries, maintained with exquisite care, and we were its components, every one of us, tuned and calibrated and ready to be played for the final time. I looked across the hall at Colvane, and I knew from the way he was not looking at me that he already knew, that he had known for years, perhaps from the beginning, and had chosen to stay anyway. Because the music was worth it. Because the sensation of being part of something that vast and that powerful and that terrible was, for a man who had been raised from childhood to crave sensation above all things, irresistible. He had weighed the truth against the feeling, and the feeling had won, and that, more than anything, was the moment I understood the difference between him and me. The woman in Ebanmir had sung 3 notes to her child, and those 3 notes had broken something in me that Tessane had spent 19 years constructing. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough. Enough that when the truth about what she was finally became audible to me, I did not immediately close my ears and pretend I had heard nothing. I listened, and listening, I began to look. It started with Gilt Harmonic, the harmonic's composer. He was the member I had mentioned least, because for most of my life he had been a background figure, a gaunt, hunched presence who rarely spoke and spent most of his time in the lower chambers of the estate, working on the compositions that the harmonic would perform during renderings. He had been a nobleman once, centuries ago, or so the story went, a patron of the arts on some world whose name had been lost to time, who had discovered the old instruments and devoted himself to understanding them with a fervor that eventually attracted the attention of something in the warp. By the time I knew him, he was barely recognizable as human. His spine had curved into an S shape that forced him to move in a sideways shuffle. His fingers, of which he now had 14 on each hand, were long and pale and constantly moving, tapping out rhythms on whatever surface was closest. His face was the worst. It had stretched vertically, the jaw elongating and the forehead rising, until his features occupied a space that was nearly twice the height of a normal human head. His eyes had migrated upward and inward, sitting close together above a nose that had flattened to almost nothing, and his mouth, when it opened, revealed 3 rows of teeth arranged in concentric semicircles, each row slightly offset from the one before it. And yet he could still compose. Throne could he compose. The music that Gilt Harmonic wrote was the backbone of every rendering, every public performance, every private recital that the harmonic had conducted in my lifetime. He wrote in a notation system that no one else could fully read, scratching symbols onto parchment with his 14 fingers, moving in coordinated bursts that produced pages of dense, intricate composition in minutes. Tessane could interpret his work, and the senior devotees could sight-read most of it, but only Grail himself understood the full depth of what he had written, the layers of harmonic meaning that went far beyond what the ear could perceive and reached into the vibrational structure of reality itself. After the announcement of the culmination, I went to Grail, not because I trusted him, I did not trust anyone, but because he was the one person in the harmonic who might be capable of telling me what the culmination would actually do, as opposed to what Tessane said it would do. I found him in his chamber, surrounded by stacks of parchment, his 14 fingers tapping an irregular rhythm on the stone floor as he stared at a composition spread across 3 separate tables. He looked up at me with those high, close-set eyes, and he made a sound that I think was laughter. "You heard it," he said. "Not a question. You heard what she is." I said yes. He nodded, the motion exaggerated by the length of his skull, and he pointed to the composition on the tables. "This is the culmination," he said. "I have been writing it for 87 years. It is the finest thing I have ever composed. It will open a door that has never been opened before, and every person in this building will die when it plays." He said it without emotion, the way you might describe the weather. I asked him why. Why would the harmonic's members die? "Because we are the instruments," he said. "Not the old instruments, not the Caravan or the Voxalis or any of the others. Us. Our bodies, our voices, our neural pathways that have been shaped by decades of exposure to warp-resonant frequencies. We are the instruments she has been tuning, all of us. And when the culmination plays, she will play us. She will play us until we break. And when we break, the energy that is released will be enough to tear the veil. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. The rendering is the model, scaled up. Instead of 1 subject, 300. Instead of a single sustained note, a full symphonic composition played on 300 living instruments until every one of them cracks. And the sound of their cracking becomes the sound that ends the world. I asked him if Tessane had told him this. She did not need to tell me. I wrote the composition. I know what it does. I have always known. He tapped his fingers on the floor in that irregular rhythm, and his 3-rowed mouth stretched into something that was technically a smile. "I do not mind. It will be the greatest performance in the history of this galaxy. My name will echo in the warp for eternity. I have been waiting 87 years for this." He paused. The tapping stopped. All 14 fingers went still at once, which I had never seen before. "But it must be played correctly," he said, and his voice dropped to something lower and harder, and stripped of the dreamy indifference that had colored everything else. Every voice, every instrument, every frequency in its precise assigned position. I did not spend 87 years composing a symphony to have it performed with missing parts. The culmination is not a campfire song. You cannot simply hum over the gaps. If a single critical voice is absent, the entire harmonic structure collapses. The veil does not tear. The energy disperses. And my composition, my life's work, becomes noise. He leaned forward, those close-set eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made the hairs on my arms stand upright. "You are a critical voice, Veshken. She assigned you the descending bridge in the 4th movement. Without it, the resonance cascade that connects the 3rd and 5th cannot sustain itself. Without you, the culmination fails." I understood then why he had told me the truth. Not out of concern for my survival, not out of any latent moral objection to 300 people being played to death. Grail Henneke was an artist, the purest and most monstrous kind, and he had spent nearly a century on a single composition, and he would rather see it unplayed than played badly. If I stayed, the culmination would proceed, and it would either be perfect or it would be a catastrophe, and Grail could not control which. But if I left, if the critical voice was removed from the ensemble, then the culmination simply could not happen. Not this year, not with this arrangement. Tessane would have to wait, to acquire a new voice, to retune the entire composition around the replacement, and that would take years, decades perhaps. And in those decades, Grail's composition would remain what it was: potential, unrealized perfection. The greatest piece of music never performed, which was, to a man like Grail Henneke, infinitely preferable to the greatest piece of music performed with a wrong note. I left his chamber without answering. I went to my rooms and I sat on the edge of my bed and I listened to the subsonic pulse in the walls, the heartbeat of the estate that was, I now understood, the heartbeat of Tessane herself, the slow, patient rhythm of a demon waiting to feed. And I made a decision, not a heroic decision, not the kind of decision that the protagonists of Imperial propaganda make. The noble sacrifice, the defiant stand, the glorious martyrdom in the Emperor's name. I made the decision of a man who has been told that he is going to be eaten and would prefer not to be. I decided to run. The problem was timing. The culmination was scheduled for the night of Pelathian's autumnal equinox, 12 days away. Tessane would spend those 12 days in preparation, calibrating each member of the harmonic to their specific role in the composition, adjusting frequencies, fine-tuning harmonic relationships, ensuring that every instrument, human and otherwise, was in perfect condition for the performance. During this period, the estate would be locked down, no one in, no one out. The harmonic's external networks would be shut down to prevent any information leakage. The 12 noble subjects had already been identified and would be acquired in the final 3 days before the event. I could not leave through the front gates. I could not signal anyone outside. I could not sabotage the culmination without being detected, because Tessane could hear everything that happened within the estate, every whispered word, every accelerated heartbeat, every slight deviation from normal harmonic behavior. She was, after all, a demon, and the estate was her body as much as the white-haired woman in the violet gown was her body. The walls were her skin. The subsonic pulse was her heart. The music that played constantly through every corridor was her voice. But I had one advantage that no one else in the harmonic possessed. My inner ear did not work the way Tessane thought it did. She believed she had created a passive receptor. And she was right, up to a point. But the inner ear was also a transmitter. I could project as well as perceive, pushing sound outward into the vibrational substrate of reality with the same precision that I used to pull it inward. I had discovered this years ago, in private, and had kept it hidden with an instinct for self-preservation that I now recognize as the dead boy's last gift to me. Hend Polek, who had lived and died on Drenholm and whose name I had buried so deep that even Tessane could not find it, had given me the ability to lie, not with words, but with sound. I could project a false harmonic signature that masked my true emotional state, and I had been doing it for years. Tessane did not know I was afraid. She did not know I had spoken to Grael. She did not know that the instrument she had spent 2 decades tuning was already out of alignment. I waited 7 days. 7 days of rehearsals and calibrations and shared meals with people I had known for most of my life, all of them preparing for a performance that would kill them. 7 days of projecting a false harmonic so flawlessly that the demon at the center of our existence could not hear the dissonance beneath it. On the 3rd day, I considered telling Even, not from any hope that she would join me, but because some part of me still thought of her as the girl with the frown, the survivor from Grunstadt, the only other person in the galaxy who had walked the same path I had walked. She was in the practice hall, working through her part of the culmination's composition on a pair of old instruments. her elongated pupils narrowed in concentration, her body swaying with a fluid motion that was no longer entirely voluntary. The warp moved through her when she played. It had done so for years. I stood in the doorway and I listened to her harmonic signature, and I searched it for something I could reach, some fragment of the feral world girl who had once frowned at everything because frowning was the only defense she had. And I found nothing. What I found instead was a signature so deeply enmeshed with the frequencies of the warp that separating them would be like separating a river from its current. If I told Yvain the truth, that the culmination would kill her, she would not be frightened. She would be delighted. She would consider it the ultimate sensation, the final and most perfect experience, the breaking point she had been racing toward since the day she first picked up an old instrument and played it like she was trying to shatter it. Telling Yvain the truth would be giving her exactly what she wanted, and she would tell Tessane, not out of loyalty, but out of sheer euphoria, because Yvain had never learned to keep a beautiful thing to herself. I turned away and left her to her rehearsal. On the 5th day, Tessane came to me. It was evening. I was in my chambers, seated on the floor with the caravan across my lap, running through my assigned passages for the culmination. She entered without knocking, as she always had, as though the concept of a closed door between herself and any member of the harmonic was an absurdity beneath consideration. She sat beside me on the floor, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth that radiated from her skin, a warmth that I now understood was not body heat, but something else, the thermal signature of a warp entity maintaining its grip on a physical form. She was barefoot, her hair was unbound. She looked to anyone without the inner ear like a woman visiting a student she cared for. "Play for me," she said. I played. I played the passage I had been rehearsing, a long descending sequence on the caravan that required sustained control and precise finger placement on the silver wires. And I played it perfectly because I could not afford to play it any other way. She listened with her eyes closed, her head tilted at that familiar angle. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her eyes and looked at me, and her violet irises had darkened to something closer to black, and she said, "You play differently now, Veshkin. Something in your lower register has shifted. A half tone, perhaps less. When did that happen?" My heart rate did not change, my breathing did not change, my harmonic signature, the false one, the one I was projecting with every fiber of my being, did not waver. Because if it wavered, even for a fraction of a second, she would hear it and I would never leave this estate alive. I told her I had been experimenting with finger positioning on the lower strings, a minor technical adjustment. I demonstrated, playing the passage again with a slightly different hand shape, producing the same shift she had noticed, but attributing it to mechanics, rather than to the fact that my soul was screaming at a frequency she was not designed to detect. She watched my hands for a long time. Then she reached out and placed her palm flat against my chest, over my heart, the same gesture she had made when she first named me on the embarkation deck of a merchant freighter 19 years ago. Her hand was warm and smooth and perfectly still, and I could feel, beneath that stillness, the faintest suggestion of something enormous pressing against the inside of her skin, testing the boundary between what she appeared to be and what she was. "You are my finest work," she said. "The culmination will not be the same without you. You know that." I told her I was honored. I told her I was ready. I told her every lie I needed to tell in a voice that did not shake and a harmonic that did not crack. And she looked at me for 3 more seconds that lasted approximately 1,000 years. And then she smiled and she stood and she left. I did not move for 10 minutes after she was gone. I sat on the floor with the caravan across my lap, and I listened to my own heartbeat, which was now racing at a tempo that would have been audible to anyone with basic medical training. and I understood with perfect clarity that I had perhaps 2 days before she heard through my projection. The halftone she had noticed was real. It was the sound of the Ebanmir lullaby, buried deep in my lower register, changing the fundamental frequency of everything I played. I could hide it, but not forever. And Tessane had the patience of something that does not age. On the 8th night, I went to Colvain's chambers. I told him what Grael had told me. I told him what Tessane was. I asked him to come with me. He listened in silence, sitting on the edge of his bed with his gloved hands folded in his lap, his luminous eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond my left shoulder. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know." I asked him how long he had known. "Since I was 19. She showed me. She took off the mask just for a moment, and she showed me what she was. She wanted me to see. She said it was a gift." I asked him why he had stayed. He looked at me then directly, and his expression was the saddest thing I have ever seen on a human face. "Because where else would I go, Veshken? What else am I? I was 4 years old when they took me. Everything I know, everything I can do, everything I am, she built. Take her away, and what is left? A man who can hear too much and feel too little, and cannot walk through a crowded street without being overwhelmed by the noise of 100 heartbeats he does not care about." He paused. "She loves us. You know that. In her way, she loves us. Is it so terrible to be loved by something vast?" Yes. The answer is yes. But I did not say it because I could see in his eyes that he already knew and that knowing had not been enough. Colvain would not come with me, but he did one thing. He told me about a passage beneath the estate's eastern wing, a drainage conduit that ran from the sub-basement to a culvert a half-kilometer outside the perimeter. It had been sealed years ago, but the seal was old and degraded, and a man with the right tools could break through it in an hour. He told me when Tessavane's attention would be most fully occupied during the midnight calibration sessions when she was deep in communion with the composition and her awareness of the estate's periphery diminished to almost nothing. I asked him what would happen to him when Tessavane discovered I was gone. "She will know I helped you," he said. "She will hear the gap in my signature the way she hears everything. And she will ask me why, and I will tell her the truth, because I have never lied to her and I do not intend to start now." He smiled, and the smile was the worst thing about the whole conversation. "It will not matter. The culmination is in 4 days. Whatever she does to me, I will not feel it for long." I left his chambers. I did not embrace him. I did not thank him. I did not say goodbye. I walked out and I closed the door, and I never saw Colvain Resh again, and I carry the weight of that the way a planet carries its moons, in silence, in orbit, forever. On the night of the 11th day, during the midnight calibration, I took the Voxalis from the vault where Tessavane kept the old instruments. I do not know why. It was not part of any plan. But when my hand closed around that warm black glass and I felt the negative note humming against my palm, that shaped silence that was the opposite of everything the harmonic had ever played, something in me recognized it as the only honest sound in the building. I tucked it inside my shirt and descended into the sub-basement of the eastern wing with a pry bar I had taken from a maintenance alcove and a projection running at full strength, broadcasting the harmonic signature of a man sleeping peacefully in his chambers. I had been rehearsing the projection for 3 days, recording my own sleep signature during naps and learning to reproduce it while fully conscious. It was exhausting. Maintaining 2 simultaneous harmonic outputs, the false sleep signature broadcast toward the estate's upper levels and the dampened null signature that masked my physical presence in the sub-basement, required a concentration so absolute that I could feel the strain as a physical heat behind my eyes. The drainage conduit was where Colvain had said it would be. The seal was corroded iron. thick but brittle, and it took me 40 minutes of careful prying to break through without producing a sound that would carry through the stone. 40 minutes during which the midnight calibration continued above me, Tessane's attention fixed on the 300 instruments she was preparing for the performance. Her awareness contracted to the chamber and the composition and the frequencies she was fine-tuning with a demon's infinite precision. 40 minutes during which I did not breathe any harder than I had to, did not allow my heartbeat to accelerate beyond its resting tempo, did not permit a single involuntary thought to disturb the false signature I was projecting. The seal broke on my 7th attempt. The sound was a dull crack, muffled by the stone and the earth and the distance. But it carried. I felt it carry. I felt the vibration travel through the floor and up through the walls and into the substrate of the estate where Tessane's awareness lived like a spider in a web. And for one terrible second, the subsonic pulse that ran through the building stuttered. A single missed beat, the heartbeat of the estate pausing as the demon that was its soul noticed something, a disturbance at the edge of her perception, an anomaly she could not quite identify. I froze. I dropped into a state of absolute harmonic stillness that Tessane herself had taught me, a technique for achieving perfect silence during the most delicate passages of a rendering, and I held it. I held it while the walls around me seemed to breathe, seemed to press inward as though the stone itself was searching for the source of the disturbance. I could feel her attention sweeping through the building like a beam of sound, probing corridors and chambers and sleeping minds, and I could feel it approaching the sub-basement with the slow inevitability of a tide coming in. And then Culmination played. I heard it through the stone, faintly, distantly, the unmistakable voice of the caravan rising from somewhere in the estate's upper levels. A single sustained note, clear and beautiful and utterly inappropriate at midnight during a calibration session. It was the kind of sound that would pull Tessane's attention like a shout, pulling the attention of a crowd. Not because it was loud, but because it was wrong, because it disrupted the pattern she had established. It was Culmination, and Culmination did not make mistakes. And if he was playing when he should not be playing, then something was happening that required her immediate focus. He was buying me time. He was standing somewhere in the estate that had been his home for 30 years, and he was playing the instrument he loved more than anything in this life or any other. And he was doing it, knowing that every note drew her attention away from me and toward him, knowing that when she found him, she would hear the gap in his signature, and she would know. I crawled into the conduit, and I did not look back. The tunnel was half a kilometer of darkness and stagnant water and rust, and the compressed blackness of earth pressing in from all sides. I crawled on my hands and knees through filth that I could taste and smell and feel seeping through my clothing, and I projected my null signature with every scrap of concentration I had left, and I listened. Behind me, through the stone, through the earth, through the rapidly increasing distance, I could still hear the caravan. Culmination was still playing. The notes were changing now, shifting from the sustained tone into something else. A melody I recognized, one of the first pieces he had taught me when I was a child, a simple ascending progression that we used to play together in the practice halls while the sun set through the estate's curved windows. He was playing our song. He was playing it for me, and he was playing it for Tessane, and he was playing it for himself, and each note was a step closer to the end of everything he was. The melody stopped when I was perhaps 300 meters into the tunnel. It did not fade. It did not trail off. It stopped cleanly between one note and the next, the way a string stops vibrating when a hand clamps down on it. And in the silence that followed, I heard something else, a sound that came not through the stone, but through the inner ear, a sound that existed in the vibrational substrate where Tessane and I and every member of the harmonic were connected like strings on the same instrument. Colvain's harmonic signature, the one I had known for 19 years, the one I could have identified among a million others, changed. It did not diminish or distort. It changed key. It shifted from the warm, controlled, precisely calibrated frequency that I associated with everything Colvain was into something else, something discordant and fractured and rising in pitch. The sound of a string being tightened past its breaking point. And then it broke. The signature snapped and scattered and was gone, and in its place there was silence. And the silence was the shape of a man who had loved me enough to die for my escape, and whose name I will carry in my chest until whatever passes for music finally stops. I emerged from the culvert into the open air of Pelethin 4, and I lay on my back in the mud, and I looked up at stars I had not seen in 19 years, and I did not cry because the harmonic had never taught me how. I was 25 years old. I had spent 19 of those years inside the Gilt Harmonic. I could play 6 instruments that should not exist. I could hear the emotional state of every living creature within 100 meters. I could kill a man with my bare hands in perfect silence. I could project a false harmonic signature that fooled a demon of Slaanesh. And I could not, for the life of me, remember the melody of the lullaby I had heard in Ebanmir. I made it to Morven's commercial port by dawn. I stowed away on a bulk hauler bound for the Corvessian transit hub. I changed ships twice more, losing myself in the river of human traffic that flows endlessly between the worlds of the Imperium, a river of pilgrims and traders and refugees and soldiers that is so vast and so continuous that one more anonymous body in its current attracts no more attention than one more drop of water in an ocean. I did not learn what happened on Pelethin 4 until weeks later, when I was 2 systems away and working as a dockhand on a freight station called Obelus. The news came through on a General Administratum bulletin, buried among routine reports of tithe adjustments and shipping lane closures. Pelethin IV had been subject to a major inquisitorial action. A Slaaneshi cult of significant size had been identified and destroyed in a combined operation involving elements of the Ordo Hereticus and the Adepta Sororitas. The cult's compound had been razed. Numerous casualties were reported on both sides. The planetary governor had been found to be complicit and had been removed from office and executed. The world was under quarantine pending a full investigation. No mention of the culmination, no mention of a breach in the veil, no mention of a demon world or a permanent warp rift, or the sound of a door opening that could never be closed again, which meant one of 2 things. Either Tessane had been stopped before the culmination could be completed, or she had not attempted it at all. And I knew with a certainty that required no evidence and no explanation that it was the latter. Tessane was a demon. She had been operating on Pelethin for centuries. She was patient and she was clever, and she would not have allowed herself to be caught unless she chose to be caught. The Inquisition had not found her. She had let them find the harmonic, the estate, the evidence, the devotees who were too far gone to save and too useful as sacrificial distractions to waste. She had burned the harmonic because the harmonic had served its purpose, or because the harmonic had been compromised, or because one of its instruments had gone missing and the composition could no longer be played as written. Because of me. The culmination failed because I was not there to play my part. Whatever specific role Tessane had assigned me in the composition, my absence had created a gap that could not be filled, a missing note that made the entire structure unstable. She had cut her losses. She had fed the harmonic to the Inquisition as a distraction, and she had disappeared back into the warp to wait and to plan and to begin again, somewhere else, on some other world, with some other children stolen from their beds. Colvane was dead. Yvain was dead, and I knew she had died smiling, had died leaning into the final note, the way she had leaned into every note before it, with her whole body and her whole ruined soul. Grail Henneke was dead. Calpurnia was dead. 300 people who had been my community, my family, my world for the better part of 2 decades, all of them gone. And I was alive, alone, on a freight station in a system I had never heard of, eating reprocessed protein paste from a tin and sleeping in a maintenance closet. The subsonic pulse I could still feel vibrating in my bones was not the station's engines. It was the memory of a heartbeat that had been with me for so long that my body had forgotten how to exist without it. I spent 3 years moving, station to station, world to world, taking whatever work was available and leaving before anyone could learn my name. Dockhand, loader, sanitation detail, the kind of jobs that require a body and a willingness to show up and nothing else. I told no one where I came from. I invented names and histories so generic they were impossible to verify and equally impossible to remember. I was Sev on Obelis. I was Thren on a mining world whose designation I have forgotten. I was Collis on a Chartist vessel running supplies to a naval depot in the Kalia system. I was no one. I was nothing. I was a hole in the shape of a man, and I filled the hole with labor and silence and the reprocessed taste of food that I had once known how to enjoy but could no longer distinguish from ash. The inner ear did not go away. I heard everything. Every harmonic signature, every emotional current, every subsonic whisper of the machinery and the people around me. On quieter stations, it was manageable. On busier worlds, it was overwhelming, a constant barrage of sound that made me want to claw the ears from my head. I managed by retreating, taking shifts in isolated sections, sleeping in storage rooms where the only sounds were mechanical and predictable. On the Chartist vessel where I served as Collis, something happened that I did not understand until much later. I was working a maintenance shift in the lower cargo hold, alone, or so I thought. The hold was vast and poorly lit, and filled with the rhythmic groaning of the ship's hull as it pushed through the Imperium behind its Geller field. I was replacing a corroded coupling bracket and not thinking about anything at all, which meant that the inner ear, unpoliced, was doing what it always did, projecting. Not deliberately, not with intent, but the way a hot surface radiates warmth whether it wants to or not. The faculty that Tessane had built inside me was pushing sound outward into the vibrational substrate, leaking fragments of the frequencies it had absorbed over 20 years of saturation. A woman came down the ladder into the hold, cargo master's mate, mid-40s, thick-armed, face like a clenched fist. She had been curt with me since I boarded, suspicious of new hands the way career voidfarers always are. She walked past me toward the manifest terminal at the far end, and I heard her harmonic signature shift as she entered my radius. A subtle thing, a loosening. The tightness in her shoulders eased by a fraction. Her breathing deepened. She stopped at the terminal and started logging entries, and then, without any apparent reason, she began to hum. 3 notes, repeating. I froze with the bracket wrench in my hand. She was not humming the Ebanmir lullaby. She could not have known it. But the pattern was the same. 3 notes, simple, cycling, the kind of melody that rises from the back of the throat when the body is relaxed and the mind is unfocused, and something in the air has made the world feel fractionally less harsh than it usually does. "Nice in here today," she said without looking up from the terminal. "Quieter than usual, almost peaceful." She paused. "You're all right, Collis, for a new hand." She left. I stood in the cargo hold and I listened to the echo of her 3-note hum fading into the hull groans, and I felt something cold settle in the base of my spine. She had not chosen those notes. They had been given to her, pushed into her subconscious by the thing I carried inside me, the warp-touched resonance that Tessane had planted 2 decades ago. I had made her feel at ease. I had made her hum. I had done it without wanting to and without knowing how to stop. And the woman had walked away thinking the hold was simply having a good day. I did not repent after that. I did not fall to my knees or beg the Emperor's forgiveness. What happened was slower and quieter. I listened. Over months and years in stations and holds and hab blocks across half a dozen forgettable worlds, I listened to the ordinary music of ordinary human life, the rough and imperfect sound of people doing the best they could, and I let it fill the space that the harmonic had hollowed out inside me. And I tried, with diminishing success, to stop leaking. I arrived on Carath Secundus 4 years after my escape from Pelethan. It was a frontier colony, newly settled, with a population of maybe 80,000 spread across a dozen settlements connected by unpaved roads and a single overtaxed rail line. It was about as far from the gilded spires of Elenthor as it was possible to get without leaving the Imperium entirely, and that was why I chose it. I took a name, Ren Goss, and I took a job, maintenance worker at the settlement's water reclamation facility, and I rented a room in a hab block that smelled of damp concrete and industrial cleanser. And for the first time in my life, I attempted to be no one and nothing, and to want no more than what a normal person wants. It worked, for a time. I fixed water processors, and I ate in the common hall, and I nodded at my neighbors, and I slept at night, and I woke in the morning, and the days passed in a rhythm that was so mundane and so predictable that it was almost soothing. I did not play music. I did not listen with the inner ear, or I tried not to, though the effort of suppressing it gave me headaches that sometimes lasted for days. I did not think about the harmonic or Tessane or the Voxalis, or the man I had killed in the alley in Morven. I was Ren Goss. I fixed water processors. That was the entirety of my identity, and I clung to it with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a piece of wreckage. 18 months into my time on Carath Secundus, the Inquisition found me. I should have expected it. A man does not escape a centuries-old Slaaneshi cult without attracting attention, and the Ordo Hereticus is nothing if not thorough. They had been tracking me since Obalus, following the trail of false names and short employments that I had left across the subsector, like a breadcrumb trail for anyone with the resources to connect the dots. They came for me on a rest day early in the morning, 4 Inquisitorial stormtroopers in black carapace armor, and a woman in a long coat who introduced herself as Interrogator Press-Sack of the Ordo Hereticus, and informed me that I was being detained for questioning in connection with the destruction of a heretical organization on Pelethan 4. I offered no resistance. I went with them because I was tired, and because the alternative was death, and because some part of me, the part that still listened despite everything, had been waiting for this since the day I crawled out of that drainage conduit. They found the Voxalis in my quarters, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a storage crate, and the way Interrogator Pressack's hands trembled when she held it told me she had some idea of what it was. I never saw it again. That was 2 years ago. I have been in this facility since then, in this room with its gray walls, and its single lumen globe and its uncomfortable chair, telling my story to a rotating series of interrogators who all ask the same questions in the same order and all make the same faces when I give them answers they do not want to hear. They want to know about the harmonic's structure, its membership, its connections to other Slaaneshi cells. They want to know about the old instruments and the renderings and the culmination. They want to know about Tessane, what she looked like, how she behaved, what signs might allow the Inquisition to identify her if she resurfaces on another world. I have told them everything, holding nothing back, because there is nothing left to protect, and no one left to protect it for. But the thing they want most, the thing they keep coming back to, session after session, is the thing I cannot give them. They want me to be sorry. They want me to condemn what was done to me and what I did in the Harmonic's name. They want the story of my corruption to be followed by the story of my redemption, a clean narrative arc from darkness into light, from the grip of chaos to the embrace of the Emperor, from monster to man. And I cannot give them that because it would be a lie, and I have spent enough of my life inside lies. I am not sorry, not in the way they want. I am sorry that people died, in the abstract way that any functioning person is sorry when they learn that people have died. I am sorry that Colvane died, in a personal way that I will not discuss further, because it is mine and I will not give it to an interrogator to be filed and analyzed and cross-referenced. I am sorry that I was taken from Drenholm, in the sense that I recognized that a different life was possible and that the dead boy, Hend Polek, deserved the chance to live it. But I am not sorry for what I became, because what I became is the only thing I am, and to be sorry for it would be to wish myself out of existence, and I am not ready for that. Not yet. I miss the music. That is the part that frightens the interrogators most, and it is the part I will not pretend away. I miss the sound of the old instruments. I miss the way the Harmonic's estate hummed at night, that subsonic lullaby of warp-touched stone and demon's breath. I miss the feeling of a rendering at its peak, the moment when every instrument and every voice aligned, and the sound became something more than the sum of its components, something that touched the veil between worlds and made it tremble. I miss it the way an addict misses the substance that is killing them, with full knowledge of what it is and complete inability to stop wanting it. The melody I hear now, the human melody, the rough, imperfect song of ordinary life, it is real and it is good and it sustains me. But it is not enough. It will never be enough. The Harmonic opened something inside me that cannot be closed, a door of the ear that leads to sounds no human was meant to hear, and the silence on this side of that door is a kind of deafness that I carry every day. Tessane is still out there. I am certain of it. A demon does not die because its cult is destroyed. She shed the Harmonic the way a serpent sheds its skin, and she slithered back into the warp to wait, and somewhere on some world that does not yet know what is coming, she is already beginning again. New children, new instruments, a new composition for a new culmination. The melody she is writing requires only one thing to be complete, and that is time. She has an eternity of it. And I am here, in this room, with you, telling you everything I know, which is everything I am, which is the sound of a boy being stolen from a factory world and turned into an instrument and played for 19 years and then discarded when the concert was cancelled. That is my story, the full measure of it. The interrogators before you heard it, and they filed their reports, and they moved on. And here comes the next one with the same questions and the same expressions and the same desperate need to hear me say, I am saved. I will tell you what I told them. I hear everything in this room. The hum of the lumen globe, which is slightly out of calibration and produces a frequency that would drive most people to irritation within an hour, though they would not know why. The rhythm of the air recycler, which cycles every 37 seconds and creates a brief harmonic interference pattern on each cycle that sounds to me like a single note from a caravane played very far away. The sound of your heartbeat, which has been accelerating for the past several minutes, not from fear, but from something else, something I recognize. You have been listening to me describe sounds you have never heard and sensations you have never felt, and some part of you, the part that the ecclesiarchy spends so much effort trying to suppress, wants to know what it sounds like. The rendering, the old instruments, the culmination that never was. You want to hear it. You are sitting in this chair across from a confessed heretic and murderer, and you are wondering what it would be like. That is how it starts. That is always how it starts. A note. A single perfect note that makes the world seem flat and gray by comparison. And then the hunger for another. I have been called an instrument my entire life. I was tuned by a demon and played in a concert of suffering and discarded when the music stopped. But instruments do not stop making sound just because the musician puts them down. They resonate, they vibrate. They carry the memory of every note that has ever been played on them, and those notes leak out, slowly, into the air around them, and the air carries them to anyone close enough to listen. You have been listening for 6 hours now. I can hear what it is doing to you. I can hear the change in your signature, the subtle shift in frequency that tells me the door in your ear is starting to open. I did not do this on purpose. I want you to know that. I am not Tessane. I do not cultivate. I do not harvest. I am just a broken instrument that still makes sound. And the sound I make carries something in it that I cannot remove, a resonance that Tessane spent 2 decades building inside me, something that will outlast me and every interrogator you send into this room. So go. File your report. Send the next one. I will tell the story again, from the beginning, the same way I have told it every time, because it is all I have, and because the telling is the only music left to me. And if tonight, lying in your bunk, you find yourself humming a melody you do not recognize, 3 notes, simple, repeating, a lullaby from a world you have never visited, or whistling, perhaps, the way a girl on an industrial world once whistled, better than anyone, before she was made to forget, do not be alarmed. That is just the sound of something opening,